The rain fell in steady sheets over Los Angeles, the sound of it merging with the muted hum of traffic and distant sirens. Frank Sullivan stood motionless in the sprawling evergreen cemetery, his fingers gripping a bouquet of white lilies. The tombstone in front of him bore the name Rebecca Turner and a short, haunting epitaph. Asterisk, forever innocent. Asterisk. He knelt, placing the flowers gently at the base, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Rebecca. Every day I'm sorry." This was Frank's weekly ritual, a penitence that had become his anchor in the chaos of his guilt. The face of Rebecca, a hostage caught in a disastrous operation he had led as a police negotiator, haunted his dreams and shadowed his waking moments. That night, when one errant shot from his team ended her life, cost him everything: his career, his reputation, and the fragile connection he had with his daughter, Emily. Emily was a bright, determined young woman in her early 20s, whose vibrant personality clashed with Frank's heavy demeanor. While Frank retreated into isolation, consumed by his failures, Emily embraced life with bold confidence. Photography had become her escape and her passion, a pursuit she was determined to make a career out of despite Frank's overbearing protection. "Dad, I'm not a kid anymore," she had said just the night before, frustration thick in her voice. "You have to let me live my life." Frank's reply, laden with quiet intensity, had been predictable. "Living your life doesn't mean being reckless, Emily. This city isn't safe." But Emily had always been clever, perceptive, traits inherited from him, whether he admitted it or not. She understood his fear stemmed from love but refused to let it dictate her choices. That morning, after wrapping up a photo shoot in downtown Los Angeles, Emily called Frank, her tone teasing but warm. "You know, Dad, one of these days you're going to have to trust me." "Trust isn't the issue," Frank had responded gruffly, though his voice softened. "Just be careful, okay?" But before Emily could answer, the sound of a car screeching to a halt filled the line. Voices shouting in Spanish followed. Her phone clattered to the ground, and then there was silence. Frank's heart pounded as he redialed Emily's number, but it went straight to voicemail. He retraced the last location she had mentioned, the narrow streets of downtown Los Angeles teeming with people but offering no clues. The city seemed to taunt him, its sprawling chaos swallowing his daughter whole. A memory from years ago surfaced, his days as a negotiator, the adrenaline of a crisis sharp in his veins. He shook it off, focusing instead on the sinking realization that Emily was in danger. He knew this wasn't random. Emily was resourceful and unlikely to fall victim to a random act of violence. This was calculated, deliberate. His suspicions were confirmed when his old police informant, Carter, called him late that evening. "Frank," Carter said, his voice low and urgent, "I don't know what your daughter's done, but she's in deep. Morales's men grabbed her." Morales. Frank's grip on the phone tightened. Javier Morales, the infamous cartel leader, had been a thorn in his side years ago during an operation that nearly dismantled the criminal network. Morales had escaped justice then, but not before losing several of his closest associates. "They think she's the daughter of Judge Turner," Carter explained. "You know, the guy presiding over Morales's trial." Frank's mind raced. The judge. The cartel must have mistaken Emily for someone else, someone they could leverage against the legal system. Morales, cold and calculating, was known for his ruthless strategies, but he operated by a twisted code of honor. If he thought Emily was leverage, it would buy Frank time, but not much. "Where is she?" Frank demanded. "Don't know yet," Carter admitted, his voice tinged with fear. "But I can help you find out. Just don't drag me down with you." Frank hung up, his jaw set. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not to Emily. Miles away, Emily sat in a dimly lit room, her hands bound but her spirit unbroken. The warehouse smelled of oil and damp concrete. She had spent the first hour cataloging everything she could, The number of men guarding her, their weapons, the layout of the space. It was a habit drilled into her by Frank during years of overprotective parenting. "Always know your exits," he'd told her once, back when he was teaching her self-defense. Her captors, oblivious to her quiet assessment, spoke in low tones. One of them, a young man named Miguel, stood apart from the others. His expression betrayed unease, a crack in the hardened facade that the cartel demanded. Emily seized on it, her voice steady and sharp. "You don't want to be here," she said, her eyes locking with his. Miguel flinched but didn't respond. "They treat you like a pawn," Emily continued. "But you're the one who has to live with what they make you do. How long before they turn on you?" Miguel hesitated, but before he could answer, another man barked at him to keep watch outside. Emily noted his hesitation and filed it away as a potential ally in the chaos she would inevitably try to create. Meanwhile, Frank was preparing for war. He visited an old ally, Tom Alvarez, a detective still on the force. Alvarez was one of the few people who hadn't turned on him after Rebecca Turner's death, but even he viewed Frank's methods with caution. "You think Morales will just hand her back if you storm in guns blazing?" Alvarez asked, leaning against his car outside a dimly lit diner. "This isn't about doing things by the book," Frank replied coldly. "This is about saving my daughter." Alvarez sighed. "I get it. But if you go too far, you'll make it worse. Morales isn't some street thug. He'll anticipate your moves." Frank's expression darkened. "Then I'll have to do what he doesn't expect." Frank left before Alvarez could argue further. He was a man driven by desperation, his old instincts as sharp as ever. Morales was a formidable enemy, but Frank had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The stage was set. Morales watched from the shadows, intrigued by Frank's inevitable approach. Emily plotted her escape, her resolve unshaken. And Frank, with the weight of his past and the fire of a father's love, prepared to step into the darkness once more. Los Angeles braced itself, unaware of the storm about to unfold. The dimly lit streets of South Los Angeles seemed quieter than usual, the urban decay of abandoned buildings shrouded in a heavy silence. Frank Sullivan's car came to a stop in an alley a few blocks away from his target, a nondescript industrial complex rumored to be one of Javier Morales's safe houses. Carter's information had been specific. Emily had been held there recently, but the cartel moved their captives frequently. Time was against Frank, and he knew it. The former cop stepped out of the car, rain cascading down his worn leather jacket. In his hands, he carried a duffel bag filled with improvised tools and weapons. The days of him relying on official police gear were long gone. Tonight, he was operating on instinct and years of tactical training. Frank approached the complex cautiously, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The building was surrounded by a chain-link fence, its rusted edges barely held together by padlocks. From the second floor, faint light seeped through boarded windows. A low murmur of voices indicated that the cartel's operatives were inside. He crouched near the fence, pulling out a pair of wire cutters. The rhythmic snip, snip cut through the night air, the sound drowned out by the distant rumble of thunder. As the metal gave way, Frank slipped inside, his movements deliberate and silent. Inside the warehouse, Emily remained shackled to a metal chair, her wrists raw from the coarse rope binding them. Miguel, the young cartel member she had been observing, returned to his post near her. He seemed restless, his gaze flickering toward her more often than usual. "You're not like them," Emily said softly, her voice steady. Miguel's head jerked toward her. "Don't talk," he muttered, but the hesitation in his voice betrayed his unease. "I see the way they treat you," she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "You're nothing to them. A tool. A scapegoat if things go wrong." Miguel's jaw tightened, his conflicted expression deepening. Emily could see the cracks forming in his loyalty and decided to push further. "You have a choice," she continued. "Help me, and maybe you can get out of this life before it's too late." Before Miguel could respond, heavy footsteps echoed through the room. Another guard entered, barking orders at Miguel to join the others outside. The moment passed, but Emily knew she had planted a seed. Frank breached the building's outer defenses with the precision of a seasoned predator. Using a small, jury-rigged explosive, he created a distraction by detonating a generator on the east side of the complex. The lights flickered and died, plunging the warehouse into darkness. Shouts erupted from inside as several guards scrambled to investigate the explosion. Frank slipped through an open doorway, hugging the shadows. The scent of oil and mildew filled his nostrils as he moved deeper into the labyrinthine structure. In a narrow corridor, Frank encountered his first obstacle: 3 cartel members armed with pistols. They hadn't spotted him yet, their attention focused on the flickering emergency lights. Frank gripped a metal pipe he'd picked up earlier and launched his attack. The first man went down without a sound, Frank's blow catching him squarely on the temple. The second turned, raising his weapon, but Frank was faster. He rammed the pipe into the man's midsection, then delivered a crushing strike to his knee, forcing him to the ground. The third guard shouted an alarm, but Frank was already on him. They grappled, the man's gun discharging into the ceiling. Frank wrestled the weapon away and delivered a swift elbow to the man's throat, silencing him for good. Emily heard the commotion in the distance. Though she couldn't see much from her vantage point, she sensed the tension rising among her captors. Morales's men were shouting orders, their movements becoming frantic. Miguel reappeared, his face pale. He glanced at Emily, then back toward the door. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice low but insistent. "I don't know," he whispered, his hand trembling on the grip of his gun. "Something's wrong." Emily saw the fear in his eyes and made her move. "It's my father," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "He's coming for me. And when he gets here, no one will stop him." Miguel froze, her words cutting through his panic. "You can help him," she added, "or you can stay here and go down with the rest of them. Your choice." Frank moved through the warehouse like a ghost, dismantling opposition with ruthless efficiency. His Krav Maga training came into play as he utilized his surroundings to gain the upper hand. A discarded chair became a shield against a knife-wielding attacker. A broken chain served as a makeshift garrote. Each encounter left him bruised but unyielding. Finally, he reached a storage room where he found signs of Emily's presence: a shattered camera lens and a piece of rope frayed at the edges. His heart clenched, a mix of hope and rage fueling him. Before he could process the scene further, the room's door burst open. A burly cartel enforcer charged at him, wielding a crowbar. Frank barely dodged the first swing, the metal slamming into the wall behind him. The fight was brutal and messy, both men trading blows that echoed through the empty room. Frank ducked low, slamming his shoulder into the man's midsection and sending them both crashing into a stack of crates. He emerged on top, using the crowbar to pin the man's throat until his struggles ceased. By the time Frank reached the warehouse's main floor, the scene had erupted into chaos. Several guards were shouting, their flashlights slicing through the darkness as they searched for the intruder. From her corner, Emily spotted her father for the first time, her heart surging with relief. She locked eyes with him and saw the unrelenting determination in his gaze. Frank motioned for her to stay quiet, then slipped into the shadows. One by one, he neutralized the remaining guards, his movements precise and deadly. Miguel hesitated as he watched the carnage unfold. Finally, something inside him snapped. He rushed to Emily's side, fumbling with the keys to her restraints. "You're doing the right thing," Emily said, her voice firm. Miguel didn't respond, his focus entirely on freeing her. Frank confronted the last of the guards in a brutal skirmish near the exit. The man, desperate and cornered, lunged at Frank with a knife. Frank sidestepped the attack, using the man's momentum to throw him into a metal beam. The sound of the impact reverberated through the warehouse as the guard crumpled to the ground. But as Frank turned to reunite with Emily, his victory soured. Morales's men had moved her moments before he arrived. In the aftermath of the fight, Frank interrogated Miguel, who had decided to switch sides fully. "They're taking her to another location," Miguel said, his voice shaky but sincere. "A safe house near the industrial docks." Frank stared at him, his bloodied fists clenched. "Then we go to the docks," he growled. Despite the small victories, the weight of his past loomed large. The night wasn't over, and the battle for Emily was far from finished. The rain had subsided, leaving the streets of Los Angeles slick and gleaming under the neon lights of the city. Frank Sullivan maneuvered his car through the winding roads of Beverly Hills, his mind racing as he pieced together the next move. Miguel sat in the passenger seat, visibly nervous, clutching a burner phone he claimed could connect them to one of Morales's lieutenants. "They're holed up in a mansion on Galloway Drive," Miguel stammered, casting nervous glances at Frank. "Morales uses it to store cash and documents." Frank didn't respond immediately, his focus on the road and the faint glimmer of hope that Emily might still be alive. The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure tucked behind ornate gates and manicured hedges. From the outside, it seemed like nothing more than a luxurious residence. But Frank knew better. Behind its grand facade lay the nerve center of Morales's operations, a place where orders were given, money exchanged, and lives discarded. Frank parked his car a block away, opting to approach on foot. He adjusted his baseball cap low over his face and slung a delivery bag over his shoulder. The guise of a courier would buy him a few moments, just enough to get through the front gates. Miguel hesitated, his voice low. "You're crazy if you think you can just walk in there." Frank glanced at him, his expression grim. "Stay here. If I'm not back in an hour, you're on your own." The guards at the gate barely glanced at him as he strolled up, the delivery bag swinging at his side. "Package for Morales," Frank muttered, his tone curt. One of the guards stepped forward, suspicious but uninterested in digging deeper. "Leave it and go." "Can't do that," Frank replied, his voice steady. "Signature required." The guard sighed, signaling for another to scan the package. Frank's fingers tightened on the strap, his heart pounding. As the second guard leaned in, Frank struck with precision, slamming the bag into his face. The hidden weight inside, a wrench wrapped in cloth, knocked the man out cold. Before the first guard could react, Frank grabbed his collar and drove a knee into his ribs, silencing him with a swift elbow to the temple. Frank dragged their bodies into the shadows, retrieving their keycards. Slipping inside, he found himself in a sprawling foyer adorned with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and the muffled sounds of conversation came from a nearby room. Emily, meanwhile, was in the back of a transport van en route to the industrial docks. The vehicle rocked and rattled over uneven streets, but her mind stayed sharp. She had left another clue behind in the mansion, the shattered lens of her camera, deliberately placed near an office where she had glimpsed a stack of maps. One of the guards glanced at her, smirking. "Your old man's making waves, you know. Morales is gonna enjoy breaking him." Emily met his gaze with defiance. "You don't know my father," she said, her voice steady. The guard laughed, but Emily's words were not bravado, they were truth. She knew Frank was relentless. Back at the mansion, Frank moved through the halls like a shadow, avoiding the patrolling guards. His target was the office Miguel had described, a room filled with documents, laptops, and Morales's meticulous records. He crept upstairs, the wooden steps creaking faintly under his weight. As he approached the office, he heard voices inside. "You think Sullivan will come here?" one man asked. "Of course he will," another replied. "That's what Morales wants. He's setting the stage." Frank didn't wait for more. Bursting into the room, he used the element of surprise to his advantage. The two men reached for their weapons, but Frank was faster. A brutal exchange followed, with Frank leveraging the tight quarters to his advantage. A laptop was smashed over one man's head, and a desk lamp became a weapon as Frank used it to knock the other unconscious. His breath came in short bursts as he scanned the room, quickly locating a stack of maps and handwritten notes. His eyes locked onto a diagram of the industrial docks, circled in red ink. Beside it was a note in Spanish: "Move the package by dawn." Emily was the package. Frank's departure from the mansion didn't go unnoticed. A guard spotted him leaving and shouted an alarm. Within seconds, the estate erupted into chaos. Flashlights and shouts filled the air as guards swarmed toward the main gates. Frank sprinted through the sprawling gardens, using the hedges as cover. Bullets whizzed past him, one grazing his shoulder, but he didn't slow down. Reaching the edge of the property, he scaled the fence and disappeared into the night. The escape led to a high-speed chase through the rain-soaked streets of Los Angeles. Frank's car tore through the narrow lanes, Morales's men in pursuit. The storm returned with a vengeance, the downpour making visibility almost impossible. Frank's police training came to the forefront as he navigated the treacherous conditions. He deliberately led his pursuers into a tight alley, forcing one of their vehicles to crash into a dumpster. The remaining car stayed on his tail, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. Frank waited for the right moment, then slammed on his brakes, forcing the other car to swerve and spin out of control. By the time Frank reached the docks, dawn was breaking. The sprawling industrial yard was a maze of shipping containers, cranes, and warehouses. It was the perfect place for Morales to stage his final move. Miguel joined him, his loyalty cemented by the events of the night. "She'll be here," Miguel said, his voice resolute. "But so will Morales. He's expecting you." Frank nodded, his jaw set. "Good. Let him expect me." As Frank and Miguel prepared for the confrontation, Emily sat in the transport van, her hands now free thanks to a stolen hairpin. The guards hadn't noticed yet, and she waited for the perfect moment to strike. Her father was coming, of that she had no doubt. But she wasn't going to wait idly for her rescue. The pieces were falling into place, and the storm that had been brewing was about to erupt. The industrial docks of Los Angeles loomed like a metallic labyrinth under the pale light of dawn. Cranes towered overhead, their steel arms silhouetted against the soft orange glow breaking through the horizon. Frank Sullivan crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, his breathing steady despite the pounding of his heart. Miguel knelt beside him, clutching a stolen pistol with trembling hands. "They'll be moving her soon," Miguel whispered. "Morales won't wait once he knows you're here." Frank nodded, his eyes scanning the expanse of the docks. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound a potential threat. He could see several armed men patrolling near a large warehouse at the dock's edge. That had to be the rendezvous point where Emily was being held. "I'll create the distraction," Frank said, his voice firm but low. "You stick to the plan. Get her out." Miguel swallowed hard but nodded. "And Morales?" A flicker of something cold passed through Frank's eyes. "I'll handle Morales." Inside the warehouse, Emily sat on the floor, her back pressed against a cold steel support beam. Her wrists were raw from the zip ties that bound her hands, but her determination was unshaken. She had memorized the patterns of the guards outside and heard snatches of their conversations, enough to know that Morales was close. A short distance away, Morales himself stood near a row of crates, his sharp suit oddly out of place in the gritty surroundings. He watched Emily with a calculating gaze, his expression one of amused detachment. "Your father's quite the fighter," he said, addressing her in a calm, almost conversational tone. "But persistence has its limits. He'll come for you, and when he does—" Morales paused, gesturing toward a nearby table where several weapons lay in neat rows. "He'll learn what it means to cross me." Emily met his gaze without flinching. "You don't know my father," she said, her voice steady despite the fear knotting her stomach. Morales chuckled. "Oh, I know enough. A man consumed by guilt. A man willing to destroy himself to fix what can't be undone." He leaned closer, his smile dark. "We're not so different, he and I." Emily didn't reply, but her silence was defiance enough. Frank moved like a predator, his footsteps silent as he planted small charges along the perimeter of the docks. The makeshift explosives weren't designed to kill. They were meant to confuse, disorient, and draw the guards away from the warehouse. As he set the last charge, a guard rounded the corner. The man froze for a split second, his eyes widening as he spotted Frank. Frank reacted instantly, lunging forward and slamming his shoulder into the guard's midsection. The two men grappled in the narrow space between containers, their movements a chaotic blur. The guard reached for his radio, but Frank delivered a sharp elbow to his temple, knocking him unconscious. Frank retrieved the radio and quickly switched to the cartel's frequency, listening as chatter erupted over the airwaves. "Check the west side. Something's off," one voice said. "Morales wants updates every 5 minutes," another barked. Frank smirked grimly. "They don't know where I am." The first explosion shattered the morning quiet, a fiery plume erupting from a fuel barrel near the dock's edge. Shouts filled the air as guards scrambled toward the blast site, their focus diverted. Emily heard the commotion and felt a surge of hope. She strained against her restraints, her mind racing. If her father was here, she needed to act fast. Miguel used the chaos to slip into the warehouse. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to focus, his mind replaying Frank's instructions. As he crept through the shadows, he spotted Emily. She saw him too, her eyes widening in recognition. Miguel raised a finger to his lips and moved closer, crouching beside her. "Hold still," he whispered, pulling out a small knife to cut through the zip ties. Emily didn't waste time on questions. "Morales is here," she whispered urgently. "He's waiting for my dad." Miguel's face paled. "Then we have to move now." But before they could make their escape, a voice called out, "Well, isn't this touching?" Miguel and Emily turned to see Morales standing a few feet away, flanked by 2 guards. He held a gun loosely at his side, his expression one of cruel amusement. "Going somewhere?" Morales asked, his tone mocking. Outside, Frank heard the commotion and sprinted toward the warehouse, his instincts screaming that something had gone wrong. He burst through the door, his gun raised, and found himself face to face with Morales. The two men locked eyes, the air between them crackling with tension. "Let her go," Frank said, his voice low and deadly. Morales smiled. "Ah, Sullivan. Right on time. I was beginning to think you'd lost your edge." The guards raised their weapons, but Morales held up a hand, stopping them. "This isn't their fight," he said, stepping forward. "It's ours." Frank didn't lower his gun. "You're making a mistake." Morales chuckled. "I've made plenty. What's one more?" The standoff erupted into chaos as Miguel lunged at one of the guards, wrestling his weapon away. Frank fired a shot, taking down the second guard, while Emily scrambled to the side, searching for cover. Morales retreated behind a stack of crates, his gun barking as he fired at Frank. The two men engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, their movements calculated and precise. Frank ducked behind a metal pillar, his mind racing. Morales was a formidable opponent, smart, ruthless, and unpredictable. But Frank had something Morales didn't, a relentless drive fueled by love and guilt. "Come out, Sullivan," Morales taunted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "Let's end this." Frank responded with a carefully aimed shot, forcing Morales to take cover. Meanwhile, Miguel and Emily worked together to create a diversion. Emily found a stack of flares and lit one, tossing it toward the center of the warehouse. The bright, smoking flame disoriented Morales's remaining guards, giving Miguel the chance to take them out. "Go!" Miguel shouted to Emily. "Get outside." But Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward her father. "I'm not leaving without him," she shouted back. The confrontation between Frank and Morales reached its peak as the two men faced off in the open. Morales fired first, his bullet grazing Frank's arm, but Frank didn't falter. He charged forward, tackling Morales to the ground. The two men fought viciously, their blows landing with bone-crunching force. Frank managed to wrestle Morales's gun away, pressing it against the cartel leader's chest. "It's over," Frank growled, his voice filled with finality. Morales smiled through bloody teeth. "It's never over, Sullivan. Men like us, we're just waiting for the next fight." Frank hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a brief moment, the weight of his past and the life he had tried to rebuild bore down on him. But then he heard Emily's voice. "Dad." That single word snapped him back. He struck Morales across the face, rendering him unconscious, but left him alive. Frank turned to see Emily running toward him, her eyes filled with relief and tears. "Are you okay?" he asked, pulling her into a tight embrace. She nodded, her voice breaking. "I knew you'd come." Frank looked at Miguel, who stood nearby, battered but resolute. "Let's get out of here," Frank said. As the sun fully rose over the docks, the trio disappeared into the city, leaving the wreckage of the night behind. But Frank knew the fight wasn't truly over, not yet. The industrial docks were a smoldering memory as Frank, Emily, and Miguel made their way to a safe house Miguel had mentioned, an old mechanic's garage on the edge of town. The adrenaline from their escape hadn't worn off, and the silence between them was weighted with unspoken thoughts. Frank's focus was razor-sharp, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Morales was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until the debt of blood was paid. Emily broke the silence first. "We can't keep running, Dad. He's going to come for us." Frank, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit, nodded. "I know." Miguel, seated in the back, finally spoke. "Morales doesn't forgive or forget. He'll come with everything he has." Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. "Then we'll end this before he gets the chance." The garage was a relic of another era, its peeling paint and rusting tools a testament to years of abandonment. Miguel led them inside, securing the doors with chains and padlocks. Frank wasted no time assessing their resources. A half-empty toolbox, scattered industrial equipment, and a dusty cache of supplies Miguel had stashed in case things ever went sideways. "We're not staying here long," Frank said, pulling a map from the workbench. "Morales will track us eventually. We need to take the fight to him." Emily frowned. "You mean we're going after him?" Frank nodded, his voice firm. "If we keep waiting, he'll gain the upper hand. We need to hit him where it hurts." Miguel hesitated. "I might know where Morales will be." Both Frank and Emily turned to him. "He has a compound just outside the city," Miguel explained. "He uses it as a base of operations when he's planning something big. If he's regrouping after the docks, he'll be there." Frank studied Miguel's face, searching for any sign of doubt. "You're sure about this?" Miguel met his gaze. "If I'm wrong, we're dead anyway." As they prepared to leave, Emily pulled Frank aside. "Dad, are you sure about this? It's not just Morales we're up against. He has an army." Frank placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening for the first time in days. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Emily. But not this time. I'm going to protect you, no matter what it takes." Emily didn't argue, but her eyes betrayed her fear, not for herself, but for her father. The drive to Morales's compound was tense, the tension inside the car almost palpable. Miguel outlined the layout, a fortified mansion surrounded by high walls, guarded by a mix of cartel soldiers and surveillance systems. "We'll have to move fast," Miguel said. "If they spot us too early, we won't make it past the gate." Frank's plan was simple. Use the chaos of an unexpected assault to dismantle Morales's defenses before confronting the man himself. It was risky, bordering on suicidal, but there was no room for hesitation. The compound came into view, a sprawling estate hidden behind dense trees and razor wire. From their vantage point on a nearby hill, Frank could see guards patrolling the grounds, their rifles glinting under the moonlight. "Emily stays here," Frank said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Like hell I do," Emily shot back. "You need me, Dad." Frank opened his mouth to protest, but the determination in her eyes silenced him. Instead, he handed her a small knife. "Stay close to Miguel," he said. "No heroics." Emily smirked despite herself. "That's your job." Frank led the way, their approach masked by the cover of darkness. He bypassed the main gate, scaling a section of the wall using a grappling hook Miguel had salvaged. The group landed inside, crouched low as they moved through the shadows. The first guard went down without a sound, Frank's chokehold efficient and silent. Miguel took out the second, his confidence growing as adrenaline took over. Reaching the main building, Frank planted small charges at key points near the guard posts. He glanced at Emily and Miguel. "When these blow, head for the east wing. Morales will be in the central office." The explosions ripped through the compound, fire and smoke lighting up the night. Shouts and gunfire erupted as guards scrambled to respond. Frank moved like a force of nature, his movements precise and relentless. Inside the mansion, chaos reigned. Guards fired blindly, their communications scrambled by a jammer Frank had activated. Emily and Miguel slipped through the confusion, using the diversion to reach the east wing. Frank headed straight for Morales's office, dispatching anyone in his path. The memories of his years as a cop flooded back, every tactic, every instinct honed to perfection. He kicked open the office door to find Morales waiting, a pistol in one hand and a smirk on his face. "I knew you'd come," Morales said, his tone almost admiring. Frank raised his gun. "It ends here." Morales laughed, stepping to the side to reveal a remote detonator on the desk. "Careful, Sullivan," Morales said. "One wrong move, and this place goes up in flames, with your precious daughter inside." Frank's mind raced. The detonator was within reach, but Morales was faster. "You think you're the hero?" Morales sneered. "You're no different from me. You'll sacrifice anything to win." Frank's voice was ice. "The difference is, I don't leave my family behind." In a blur of motion, Frank lunged, knocking the detonator off the desk as Morales fired. The shot grazed Frank's side, but he didn't stop. The two men grappled, their fight brutal and desperate. Meanwhile, Emily and Miguel faced their own battle. Cornered in the east wing, they used everything at their disposal: broken furniture, shards of glass, even their fists, to fend off Morales's guards. "Hold the door," Miguel shouted, slamming a broken chair against the last attacker. Emily nodded, her focus unshaken despite the chaos. Frank gained the upper hand, slamming Morales into the desk. He pressed his gun to the cartel leader's chest, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You don't have the guts," Morales taunted, blood dripping from his mouth. Frank's grip tightened. For a moment, the weight of his guilt and rage threatened to consume him. But then he heard Emily's voice echo in his mind, "You're better than this." He pulled back, delivering a knockout punch that left Morales unconscious. The fight was over, but the compound was still a war zone. Frank grabbed the detonator, ensuring Morales couldn't activate it, and rushed to find Emily and Miguel. When he found them battered but alive, relief washed over him. "Let's go," Frank said, his voice steady despite his injuries. As the group fled the compound, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. The compound was a crumbling memory behind them as Frank, Emily, and Miguel drove through the deserted streets, the city still asleep under the early morning haze. The weight of the night hung heavily in the air, each of them silent, lost in their own thoughts. Blood seeped through Frank's shirt from the gunshot graze, but he ignored it, his focus on the road and the future they had barely escaped into. Miguel broke the silence, his voice a mix of exhaustion and unease. "What now? Morales might be down, but his men aren't going to stop." Frank tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We make sure he can't get back up." They arrived at a safe house Alvarez had secured for them, an abandoned diner on the edge of town, its cracked windows and peeling paint blending into the forgotten landscape. Inside, the air smelled of dust and grease, but it offered something they hadn't had all night, a moment of relative safety. Frank sat at one of the booths, wincing as Emily helped clean and bandage his wound. Miguel leaned against the counter, his hands still trembling despite the fight being over. "Why didn't you kill him?" Emily asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Frank met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Killing Morales wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't erase what he's done or what I've done. This isn't about revenge." Emily nodded, though she couldn't help but notice the unspoken pain in his eyes. As they regrouped, Alvarez arrived, his unmarked sedan pulling up outside with a screech. He entered quickly, his expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "You're lucky I got the call before Morales's men did," Alvarez said, his voice tinged with exasperation. "The compound's swarming with cops now. Morales is in custody, but don't expect it to stick without solid evidence." Frank stood, his face unreadable. "We have what we need." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket, the spoils of their raid on the compound. Miguel had uncovered it in Morales's office, a treasure trove of encrypted files detailing the cartel's operations, bribes, and murders. "This can bring him down for good," Frank said, handing it to Alvarez. The detective hesitated. "If you're right, this could dismantle his whole network. But if Morales finds a way out of this, he'll come for you, and your family." Frank's voice was resolute. "Let him try." Hours later, news broke of Morales's arrest. The files Frank and Miguel had retrieved provided the authorities with undeniable proof of his criminal empire. The media frenzy painted Morales as a shadowy kingpin finally dethroned, and while his legal team scrambled, his empire began to fracture. For the first time in years, Frank felt a sliver of peace, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't truly over. The cartel's remnants would remain dangerous, and the cost of their actions, lives lost, families broken, could never be undone. In the weeks that followed, Frank focused on rebuilding the bridges he had once burned, starting with Emily. The safe house became their temporary refuge, a place where they could finally talk without the specter of immediate danger looming over them. One night, Emily approached Frank as he sat on the porch, the glow of the city lights faint in the distance. "You didn't just save me, Dad," she said, sitting beside him. You saved yourself. Frank looked at her, his expression softening. Maybe. But I couldn't have done it without you. Emily smiled, and for the first time in years, the gap between them seemed to close. Miguel, too, found his path shifting. With Morales out of the picture, he saw a chance to start over, away from the violence and fear that had defined his life. Frank gave him a small sum of cash, barely enough to start fresh, but a gesture of faith. You earned this, Frank said. Just make sure you don't waste it. Miguel nodded, his gratitude evident. I won't. And if you ever need me. Frank shook his hand, a rare smile touching his lips. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Months passed, and the chaos of their ordeal began to fade. Emily returned to her photography, using her experiences to fuel a new project focused on resilience and survival. Her work gained recognition, her images capturing the strength of those who had faced unimaginable odds. Frank, meanwhile, found himself adjusting to a quieter life. The weight of his guilt over Rebecca Turner's death didn't disappear, but it became more bearable. He continued his weekly visits to her grave, though now he carried a sense of purpose alongside his grief. One day, as Frank and Emily shared lunch at a small cafe, the news played on a nearby television. A reporter detailed the collapse of Morales's cartel, the arrests of his remaining allies, and the ripple effect it had across the criminal underworld. Emily glanced at Frank. Looks like we made a difference. Frank nodded, his expression thoughtful. We did. But there's always more work to be done. Emily raised her camera, snapping a candid photo of her father as he gazed out the window. What's that for? He asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. For the next project, Emily replied. It's about redemption. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Just make sure you get my good side. As the sun set over Los Angeles, Frank and Emily walked together through the bustling streets. Their journey had left scars, both physical and emotional, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond. For the first time in a long while, Frank allowed himself to hope, for Emily's future, for his own redemption, and for the possibility that even in a world of chaos, there could be peace. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.